Bueno, la última sesión, esta sesión pues es como ya saben, como hemos estado viendo aquí, va a ser impartida por la doctora Raewyn Connell. Les voy a leer una pequeña biografía, mini biografía, porque tienen una trayectoria extensísima de muchísimos años, más de 40 años en la investigación. Y bueno, Raewyn Connell es especialista en masculinidades, catedrática de la Facultad de Educación y Trabajo Social de la Universidad de Sydney. Anteriormente también fue catedrática de la Universidad de California en Santa Cruz en el área de sociología y también en la Universidad de Harvard en Estados Unidos y en la Universidad de Macquarie de Sydney también en Australia. Es autora de numerosas publicaciones e investigaciones sobre temas sociales, educativos y trabaja pues el tema del género de una manera interseccional. Una de las aportaciones más importantes de Raewyn, entre otras muchas, es su concepto de sus reflexiones sobre masculinidad, que es de hecho de las primeras estudiosas que empieza a trabajar con estudios de masculinidad en los años 70. El libro más emblemático para los estudios de masculinidades es el libro que se llama así, traducido por el PUEG en la UNAM en 1995, está publicado. Y creo que hay una reedición de 2005 que se llama Masculinidades, o en el original Masculinities, y tiene otra obra emblemática, bueno, varias, pero esta también es muy importante para lo que nos ocupa el día de hoy, que es su teoría sobre teoría del sur, ¿no? La epistemología del sur, que se pone en diálogo con distintos temas de los que nos va a hablar el día de hoy la doctora Connell. Sin más preámbulo, les recuerdo que bueno, vamos a tener una charla de aproximadamente unos 45 minutos y después la parte de preguntas y respuestas que vamos a poder hacer en español y el traductor se las traducirá a la doctora Connell en inglés, a menos de que ustedes quieran hacerlas directamente en inglés, pero sería preferible que fueran en español para que aparezcan en la cámara, como se está grabando el seminario, para que aparezcan en español. Si hay audiencia que nos está viendo y no habla inglés, sería más cómodo para esas personas. Entonces, les recuerdo esto. Al final del seminario vamos a tener un pequeño ambiguo aquí afuera en el pasillo, y también les comunico que las asistencias al seminario, o bueno, las constancias de asistencia, vamos a hacer la contabilización el día de mañana, porque justo había gente que con el día de hoy cumplían 7 asistencias, que era el mínimo para poder otorgar una constancia. Algunas de las constancias pues cumplen de más las asistencias, han venido a todas las sesiones, pero había gente que justo el día de hoy cumplía las 7, y entonces tenemos que dar las constancias después. Nos vamos a poner en contacto con ustedes por correo y se las podemos hacer llegar o bien por correo postal, o nos podemos reunir y se las podemos entregar. Bueno, pues ya sin más preámbulo, ahora sí, el seminario de reflexión sobre géneros, dentro del marco de los eventos académicos estratégicos de 2014, en colaboración con el Colegio de la Frontera y la Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Baja California, pues les da la bienvenida a la última sesión del seminario. Bueno, Dr. Connell, we are ready. If you are ready to, we can start it. ¿Escucha?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Bueno.
Right.
Listo.
Okay, well, greetings to everyone from Australia. In Sydney, it's almost midsummer, though you wouldn't know it today because it's cool and wet. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you to the organisers for arranging this. And for the technical miracle that allows it to happen. My theme today is globalization, the globalization of gender, and specifically the way we can understand global relations from starting points in the global south. Let me start by the reflection that gender is commonly understood as the realm of intimacy, of deep personal relationships, sexual relationships, child rearing, domestic life, domestic violence, but very much the common understanding of gender is the realm of intimacy in personal life. Now that's correct, but that is not all that gender is. If we think, for instance, of what are the most hegemonic, most powerful forms of masculinity in the world, it's not men in the neighborhood. It's men like this. The example of a visual joke, which nevertheless comes from an important business magazine in the United States and does capture something about the world of international business management, where 96% of the top executives of the 500 most powerful corporations in the world are men, and only 4% are women. Can I check, sorry to stop for a moment, can I check that the image is showing, because I can't see your screen? Is the image coming through okay? Thank you. Thank you. That's good. Now, the world of international business, gains its profits, conducts its operations partly through gender divisions of labour on a global scale. So we have new gendered employment patterns, such as the maquilas in your country, the export factories in South China, all of which are transforming the international clothing market. And this is now an important redefinition of economic relationships, which works in relation to new patterns of global marketing, new patterns of global finance. On top of this, of course, are the illicit international trades, the narco-traffico, which is producing some horrifying effects in your country, in Colombia, in Central America, and for that matter in Southeast Asia. We have gender relations constantly being represented and renegotiated on the internet, which not only is the world's great site of pornography nowadays, but also the site of new forms of feminist activism, such as this group in Australia, who have been producing very effective online campaigns in feminist causes. So there is if you like, an international politics of gender, as well as an international production of gender that we now have to think about on a global scale. So we can think of the world of gender, the environment in which gender relations now are created as evolving not only households and local economies and local cultures, but also new arenas that have grown up, new global communication systems like the internet, transnational media, transnational corporations themselves as the dominant economic form of economic organization. global markets, which are now the key to international finance and a lot of international politics, such as the terrible politics in Russia at the moment. Yes. And the international operations of powerful states, not only the United Nations, but also international security operations, such as of the American states, currently the United States is currently doing in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other parts of the Muslim world. Okay, so these are not exactly secret facts about gender. This is well known. And gender researchers internationally respond to the global environment. In the English-speaking world, for instance, the number of research articles in journals which mentioned globalization and some gender term like gender, masculinity, femininity, etc., multiplied 10 times between the early 1990s and the early 2000s. So there has been a surge of interest in the globalization of gender. And we now have in the English-speaking world a whole small library of anthologies of research about gender in a global perspective. Now, I'm going to hold up a few examples of these books. I hope that the camera picks them up okay. Gender and Global Restructuring, which takes a kind of political economy approach, plus a bit of postmodernism. Women's Activism and Globalization, looking at feminist and women's mobilizations in different parts of the world. General Purpose Collection, Global Gender Research. And these are just a few of the publications in this genre that I happen to have on my shelves. So there is a response from gender researchers to the new global dimension, or the newly recognized global dimension. But there is a major problem with all of this research, with this whole field of research about gender and globalization. The three anthologies that I just showed you were all edited and published in the global north, United States or Western Europe. And the ideas, the concepts, the theories that frame those research projects all come from the global north. So they are northern political economy, international relations theory, feminist theories deriving from the work of people like Simone de Beauvoir, Edith Butler, Joan Scott, all of the familiar figures of northern gender theory, gender analysis, basically provide the framework for the Anglophone and I think in other languages too, most of the recent discussion about gender and globalization. And I want to argue that this is a problem. This is not a good way to go. And here I want to mention a very interesting feminist thinker from the Maghreb, the Arab-speaking northwestern region of Africa, specifically from Algeria. Her name is Mania Lasri, and about 25 years ago she published in English a couple of very important papers about women's position in Algerian society, but also about the knowledge framework and the knowledge project that was involved for Algerian feminists. And she observed that the women in countries like Algeria not only had to struggle against local patriarchal power, they also had to struggle against orthodoxies in feminist thought, because Muslim women have been constructed in Eurocentric feminist thought through forms of analysis that are very much concerned with difference between the colonized and the metropole, the women of the metropole, and of course see women of that part of the world always primarily through the lens of Islam, through their being Islamic and thus different from the Christian culture in Europe. And last week remarks that in a very, I think, a very important and phrase that is worth thinking about, that this way of understanding, of conceiving, of thinking about the women of developing countries such as Nigeria constitutes a significant era in feminist scholarship. A significant era in feminist scholarship. And it seems to me that that era affects most of the modern discussion of gender and globalization. It is really framed by an understanding of globalization and gender from the countries of the global north, from the societies of the global north, the richest and most powerful societies, which were, of course, the centres of the old empires and are now still, broadly speaking, the most privileged and centrally positioned in the global capitalist economy worldwide. Now, what I'm pointing to here is an issue that, of course, has had an enormous amount of analysis from the global south, especially. So it's something that's been taken up by the colonial school of analysis in the work of people like Aníbal Quijano from Peru, sociologist, who developed the influential concept of the coloniality of power, the continued importance in the structuring of the societies of Latin America of the imperial power, the link with the colonizing power, and then the continuing global inequalities of the neo-colonial era present. There are many other people who have made this kind of analysis. José Mauricio Dominguez in Brazil has made a powerful argument about the nature of modernity, how modernity has always been global, always been connected with colonial relationships. A whole generation of thinkers in India, the Subaltern Studies School, and post-colonial critics from India have explored similar issues. And in various ways, what these different groups of analysts have been telling us is that globalization is not homogeneous, because the principal image of globalization has come out of the global north. Globalization is in fact powerfully structured, involves immense global inequalities, power, economic situation, cultural authority, and this affects the world of knowledge and the construction of knowledge as well. So I now want to show you a map of the world as it's represented in academic publication. And here it is. In this map, every country is shown, is given its size according to the number of academic journals, scientific journals it publishes in all disciplines, natural science, social science, and humanities. And you can see from this the enormous preponderance, enormous dominance in the global academic world, global economy of organized knowledge that provides the curricula for the world's universities, the enormous predominance of the North Atlantic powers, the United States, Britain, and then the rest of Western Europe, compared with which all the rest of the world, where 4/5 of the world's people actually live, is nowhere. So you can see the way our world of knowledge production and circulation is shaped by the same kinds of forces that have produced the inequalities of the material global economy. Now, the person who's done, I think, the most to clarify, to illuminate what's happening here is an African philosopher called Raewyn Connell. I might say that if you want the spelling of the people, the names that I will mention, the last slide in this presentation will give you the spelling of the names. Raewyn Connell, very, very interesting philosopher, though little known outside Africa, has developed an analysis of the global economy of knowledge, which he sees as structured not just by material inequalities or numerical inequalities, but by a global division of labour, which has its historic roots in the world of imperialism, and which involves the division of labour between the metropole, the old imperial powers, the rich countries of the global north, which is the site of theoretical analysis, and the role of the global periphery, majority world, whose main function in the global economy of knowledge is to produce data. So we have a sort of historic process where data is swept up from the colonized world, shipped back to Europe and the United States and processed in the universities, research institutes, data banks, botanic gardens and so forth of the imperial countries, turned into organized science and then re-exported to the colonized world in the form of applied science. Now, Ndonji also argues that this involves a very characteristic attitude on the part of intellectual workers in the global south, in the periphery. This is an attitude that he calls extraversion. It's a useful phrase, meaning a useful term, meaning being oriented to intellectual authority that comes from outside your own society. Other people have called this academic dependence, but extraversion captures the kind of personal attitude that's involved, so that to be a good sociologist in the global south, to be a good physicist in the global south, you have to learn the methods that have been developed in the global north. You have to read the journals that come out of the global north. Preferably you go to the global north for your PhD or your postdoc, or to connect up with influential figures in the global north. And basically you construct your career in that ongoing relationship with the central institutions of the global economy, where the methodology, the concepts, the theoretical analysis is mainly going on. So most of the disciplines in the university world operate as if all the theory came from the global north and no theory was produced in the global south. And that is pretty much the way international gender studies also works, as I was just pointing to in the literature on gender and globalization. So if you read Australian journals publishing work in gender studies, you look at the references, who do you find? Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, Joan Scott, and so on. You look at Brazilian journals in this field, you look at the references, who do you find? Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, Joan Scott, and so on. It's a very, very familiar pattern. So familiar, in fact, that we hardly notice it until something like Rinpoche's work calls our attention to it and gives an explanation. And the problem is that although it's not recognised in the mainstream economy of knowledge, the South does produce theory, lots of it. This is very much what I was trying to document in my book, Southern Theory, excuse the advertisement, and other people working on post-colonial sociology, alternative theoretical frameworks in the social sciences and so forth, have been doing similar things recently. So the South does produce theory, it's just that it's not, or very little, incorporated into the mainstream economy of knowledge. And therefore it seems to me that if we're going to understand the issue of gender and globalisation, we must pay attention to the theoretical production of the Global South. That's where the crucial insights are most likely to come from. So what I want to do now, and this will sort of perhaps stretch your patience a little bit, but is the best way I can think of to establish this point. I want to show you some of the interesting thinkers from different parts of the Global South, some of whom you will know and some of whom you may not, all of whom, it seems to me, have had important things to say about gender and global issues. The first is from Africa, Amina Mama, who will probably be known to people who've done work on gender-based violence, because she's written important papers on this. Amina has made an important argument focused on Africa, that you cannot understand the patterns of violence in contemporary African society without understanding the violence of colonisation in Africa. Africa was the last region, major region of the world to be colonised from Europe, just as South and Central America were the first. And in all parts of the colonised world, of course, the creation of colonial society involves massive violence, including rape of indigenous women and the smashing up of existing gender orders, gender arrangements. Amina Mama argues that this constitutive violence is at the root of contemporary gender relations in the post-colonial world or neo-colonial world. And what she says of Africa seems to me an important reflection for thinking about other episodes of extreme gender violence in the neo-colonial world, such as the violence against women in the border areas of Mexico, and the violence surrounding contemporary disruptions and social conflict in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. The next person I want to mention, I'm sorry, going back a little, is Helena Safiotti from Brazil. Safiotti published her first book. I can't pronounce Portuguese very well, so I'll just give the English title, Woman in Class Society. In 1969, And the date is worth noticing because that is before the major conceptual texts from the women's liberation movement in the global north. This was truly pioneering work on a world scale that built a picture of gender as a social structure, of what, in the language of the 1960s, she called the system of stratification. Excuse me. But unlike most people who in the 1960s were writing about stratification or sex roles, which was the more common conceptual language of that time, Safiyoti saw the contemporary system of gender inequality in a historical light, understanding it as produced out of the colonial history of Brazil. And she made a pioneering analysis, a very interesting, important analysis of the sexual economy of the Portuguese colonization of Brazil, and went on, as I'm sure many of you know, to important later work on gender-based violence. Now, Safiyoti's approach to gender as a system of stratification was developed in an interesting way by Teresita de Barbieri from Uruguay. Some of you may know her in Mexico. Teresita's work is, to my mind, as a conceptual approach to gender, even more interesting than Safiyoti's, because it's more consistently historical in its understanding of the making of gender relations, and much more differentiated in its account of the different groups and processes that are involved in the construction of a differentiated gender order in post-colonial conditions across Latin America. I'm sort of giving very summary accounts of these thinkers, and I'm sure this is unfair to their work. But I want to make the point of the significant intellectual significance and sophistication of the work that has been coming out of the global south. For instance, Teresita's theoretical publications on gender were happening at much the same time that post-structuralist feminism and deconstructionist feminism was emerging in the United States. And to some extent, she does the same kind of thing, but in a very different way. That is, she's breaking up the monolithic categories of man and woman and showing how these are differentiated by class, by race, by region. So without using the North American term, this is an intersectional analysis of gender, which was produced 25 years ago. Again, it's pioneering and intellectually quite important work. The next person I want to mention is really perhaps the most stunning theorist of all. This is Meena Agarwal from India. Those of you who read in development economics will know her work because she's an economist quite well known in that field. But she's also done magnificent ethnographic work on land, village life, family divisions of labour, household politics, local politics, environment, forests, subsistence agriculture across in different regions of South Asia. She's become an important figure in feminist discussions of the environment. She's developed models of gender which emphasize the endless bargaining, not the fixed categories, but the endless bargaining that's involved in the shaping of actual gender orders. Her most important book is called A Field of One's Own, and if I had to nominate the one publication which I think gives most illumination, gives us most understanding of gender relations in our time, that's the book I'd nominate. I think she is actually the most important gender theorist in the world. And I have never seen her work discussed in any northern discussion of gender theory. She's just not there in the conventional canon, if you like, of gender theorists. And by heavens, she really ought to be. Bina Agarwal's documentation of the importance of land in gender relations for the half of the world's population that live in rural societies is a powerful one, and it can be supported from other areas of the post-colonial world. This is an Australian Indigenous intellectual, Marcia Langton, who's an important figure in contemporary debates about Indigenous issues in my country. Some time back, she published a very interesting article in a book of Aboriginal writing about land and land rights, in which she developed a gender concept which she calls grandmother's law. Her argument basically is that Aboriginal communities were so badly disrupted by the violence of British colonisation and the seizure of the land, pardon me, that many of the communities basically became unviable. Much of the population was moved off the land into the colonisers' concentration camps, and basically a major disaster affected the Aboriginal populations of the country. But there was a significant survival of people and communities, and as the colonised peoples began to come to terms with what was happening to them, one of the crucial resources, Marcia argues, was the cultural knowledge and cultural authority of the older women of the community, the grandmothers. Now, Aboriginal people in Australia use the concept of law in a much broader way than non-Aboriginal people do, to mean the whole set of customary arrangements, knowledge, partly religious, partly ceremonial, partly community-based knowledge, which basically tells the community how to go on, how to conduct its life, how to survive in a hard environment, which colonisation made harder. So grandmother's law is, to me, a very interesting concept as an element of community resilience in post-colonial conditions. Coming back to India, this is Ashish Nandi, one of the leading public intellectuals in India today, very interesting psychologist, cultural analyst, analyst of religion, involved in all kinds of public debates. Back in 1982, I think it was, maybe 1983, he published a fascinating book called The Intimate Enemy. Again, I want to call attention to the date, the early 1980s, which was before the recent surge of masculinity research in the global north and in other parts of the world. So this too is really pioneering work, because the central theme of that book, The Intimate Enemy, was the transformations of masculinity under colonisation. Nandi argues that colonisation reshaped Indian masculinities, and he analyzes particular cases, particular stories to illustrate the point. But he also makes the very important point that this also affected the colonizers, that imperialism wasn't a one-way street where gender order from Europe was imposed on indigenous communities, colonized societies. The influence went both ways, and the impact of the colonial situation went both ways too. So that British settler communities also produced new forms of masculinity, organised around the problems of sustaining colonial rule, narrowing the range of masculinities that had existed beforehand in the colonising society, and of course focusing much more on relations of power and domination, including the use of military force, which was the clue to the imperial project. This is also an issue that's been widely explored in South Africa, which is the site of some of the most interesting and important research on masculinity anywhere in the world, such as the work of Robert Morrell, a historian who has traced the making of masculinities in the colonial and apartheid period, and has gone on to analysing the changing gender orders and changing masculinities of the post-apartheid period, the period of democratisation in Southern Africa. He has, and the researchers who are brought together in this book, paint a picture which I think is also quite conceptually important, of a society which is markedly patriarchal. That's clear from the public, pardon me, the public politics and the economic structure of the country, but which is not a single patriarchy. Rather, it's a society in which there are competing patriarchal projects to a considerable extent, differentiated on ethnic or racial lines or regional lines, and which produce a much more complex gender order than we might think from the usual models of gender that we see in the global north and in the theories that come from the global north. So the colonial story involves the disarticulation of gender in the process of colonisation, the construction of new gender orders, new forms of patriarchy, masculinity and femininity, in the making and operation of colonial society. And then at least potentially, the existence of multiple gender orders or gender projects in the post-colonial era. And that, I think, is, if you like, a methodological lesson that we should bear in mind in thinking about gender order on a global scale. We're not necessarily looking at a homogeneous or simple structure at all. Now, post-colonial masculinities is an issue that came into focus in writing from intellectuals in the colonised or post-colonial world before it did in the global north. One of the interesting pioneers of this is another feminist from the Maghreb, this time from Morocco. Her name is Fatima Mernissi. She's the author of a couple of quite well-known books. Beyond the Veil was her first one. And in that, which was published in 1975, she produced a pioneering sociological analysis of masculinities in a post-colonial situation. Now that's interesting enough, but in that book and in her later work, she does something I think even more interesting, which is to try to develop an Islamic methodology of gender analysis using the traditional techniques of Islamic scholarship, which involve reflection, critical examination of the sacred texts of Islam and the, if you like, would-be sacred texts or potentially sacred texts, the traditions of the sayings of the Prophet, which are open to scrutiny and debate. And indeed, the Quran itself in Islamic tradition is regarded as the word of God, but its meaning has to be interpreted for each generation and in the light of what scholarship can say. So Fatima is one of a generation of Islamic thinkers who have applied this intellectual methodology to questions of gender. She challenges the traditional patriarchal interpretations of the texts and argues that, in fact, Islam embeds a doctrine of gender equality, a position that's now argued by Islamic feminists from many parts of the Muslim world. So that's my very short and summary tour through some of the very interesting gender theorists and thinkers around the colonial and post-colonial world. There are many more. I'm really just offering a sample. I've listed more in the papers that I've sent to some of you, and I'm very happy to send copies of to anyone who would like them and can contact me on email. I want to finish my talk now by thinking a little bit about the shape of knowledge and shape of knowledges about gender and their relationship to social struggle, on how we might think of building gender knowledge on a world scale, given these politics of knowledge that I've just been working through. One of the possibilities, I mean, once we sort of identify intellectual production from the colonized and post-colonial world, one of the possibilities is that we might be moving towards a world where there are multiple separate knowledges about gender. This is pretty much the the model of knowledge that's proposed by people who argue for the importance of indigenous knowledge as an alternative to metropolitan knowledge, a metropole-centred knowledge system, or as many indigenous knowledge practitioners say, as opposed to Western knowledge or Western science. This is an example of indigenous knowledge from Central Australia. It's an artwork, but one which involves a traditional design that embeds knowledge which is simultaneously ritual or religious knowledge, geographical knowledge, because it's about specific places where things happen and specific routes across the country, and also social knowledge, because it is in fact about gender and gender conflict. The picture is called Sugar Leaf Dreaming. Dreaming is the name for a particular body of knowledge or stories in Central Australian Aboriginal cultures. what we have here basically is a story of forbidden love. It's a Romeo and Juliet story of two young people, a young man and a young woman, who fall in love, but who are forbidden by the social rules of their society ever to marry. They belong to the wrong kinship groups. But in contrast to Shakespeare's story, where of course they have to die, Aboriginal society knew how to deal with this kind of situation and resolve it without bloodshed. And this picture sort of represents the ceremony which enacts the story of mythical figures, connects them to the present, and thus teaches the younger generation the accumulated know-how, the knowledge of gender problems and their resolution, which is held by the society. So a nice example of Indigenous knowledge that is held in a form very different from the literary form of academic journal publication. Now, we could conceive a world where every different society, every different culture had its own sort of knowledge of gender in its own language, its own symbolic form, each one being regarded as legitimate within its own boundaries and none being superior to any other. It'd be like having a mosaic, knowledge, global knowledge as a mosaic of many different coloured tiles, no one of which was central. And that's a possible way that we might think of organising knowledge about gender. But I don't think it's a very likely one. For one thing, there are actually not many sort of genuinely separate cultures left in the world. Most Indigenous languages are under serious pressure. The majority of Indigenous cultures have been, in one way or another, massively damaged by the process of invasion and colonisation. There would have to be a massive effort of restructuring, of reconstruction and reinvention to put many of the fragments of culture back together. And meanwhile, things are happening out there in the world, in those transnational spaces that I was talking about earlier, which is simply not easy to represent in the terms that Indigenous knowledge models of gender seem to offer. So I think more there's more likelihood that we will make progress by doing what Cilla Bulbeck, Australian feminist sociologist, argues for in this book, which is a critique of northern feminist dominance, but also an exploration of the different experiences of feminist movements around the world, and particularly an exploration of the terms on which they can be linked or connected. She talks about this process as braiding at the borders, like the braiding of hair or the weaving together of cloth, as the process of linking different experiences, conceptual systems, knowledge frameworks. And that's perhaps a helpful concept. We might also think of this, pardon me, in the language of South-South links, or more significantly in terms of epistemology, South-South learning. And we might think of the ways in which gender researchers, feminist activists in different parts of the world can encounter each other's work, directly or indirectly, and the way in which more complex bodies of knowledge can be built up through those encounters. Sorry. So, what this leads me to, finally, is to think about what agenda we need for building intellectual and theoretical resources for gender studies if we are prioritising the global south in response to the way the mainstream economy of knowledge has prioritised the global north. And here are just a few thoughts on that task. Firstly, we need very close attention to social movements as sources of knowledge with capacities for reflection. And by social movements, I really mean movements and not just non-government organisations, aid agencies and the like. There are capacities for reflection outside the academic and professional world, although they are not often fully acknowledged within it. There are nevertheless movements for building knowledge from working class bases, from community activism, as there were from anti-colonial resistance movements. And these are potentially important and radicalising forms of knowledge. Secondly, we need to think critically but also optimistically about education systems. Not just universities, though including universities, but also including school and technical education systems, where there is often a very considerable resource of knowledge, of experience with different forms of knowledge, curriculum building, to the extent that is not dominated centrally or by testing and competition regimes in the neoliberal style, so that the intellectual workforce, including teachers and in schools and teachers in technical education, should be thought of as a resource for knowledge building on a wider scale. Thirdly, we need to think about the knowledge building role of transnational institutions and networks. And these include some official organisations. The United Nations, UN Women, for instance, is a knowledge resource and has been able to sponsor really quite interesting international discussions, a couple of which I've been involved in, and one of which produced this quite interesting document attempting to assemble research and program experience around issues of masculinity and gender equality from different parts, mainly of the developing world. But there's a range of networks beyond the official United Nations kind of world, which have linked feminist activists in different parts of the world and have at least potentially an important role in producing a new architecture of knowledge. And finally, there's the kind of thing that we're doing today, that is making links often with at a certain amount of risk of collapse of systems, failure to connect, time lost, but also with the potential to make unexpected connections, to inspire from bringing different points of view together, and also creating friendships across distance, which I think the role of friendship in knowledge creation is very much underestimated, and I greatly value the personal connections that events like this or actual physical travel can involve or can produce. So for all of those reasons, I'm very glad to have had this chance to connect with you. I hope some of the things I've been saying seem relevant. Thanks again to the people who've organised this. And I hope we can now reconfigure our connection to make some dialogue possible. I'm not quite sure how to do that on my screen, but I'll take your advice. Thanks very much for listening.
Professor, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, we've now got back.
Great.
To the point where I can.
Okay, very good. Do you want to see the audience?
I'm happy, best if I do, but whatever works.
Okay, very good. So we're going to do a pack of questions because we need to silence your microphone. In your screen, you have an icon where you can deactivate your microphone, but you're gonna do it after. I mean, right now, because we're going to ask for questions right now. We're going to get a pack of 5 maybe, and meanwhile, we need you to.
Deactivate the microphone.
Yes, because
mute microphone. Would that be right?
Yes, that's right. That's while we get the questions. After that, we will need you to unmute for you to answer. Thank you. Very good. Ok, buenas tardes. Pues abrimos la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Vamos a tomar unas 5 preguntas más o menos y para que ella pueda contestar en bloque. Adelante.
También recuerda que hay gente que nos está viendo si tienen preguntas.
Claro, por supuesto.
Mandarlas a @elcoleg en Twitter y también en el Facebook del Coleg.
Correcto. Tenemos también disponibles para las personas que nos acompañan por internet la página de COLEF y el Facebook de COLEF. Ahí es donde pueden hacernos llegar también sus preguntas. No duden en hacerlo, estamos ahorita abriendo el espacio. Por favor. Adelante. ¿Es un micrófono? ¿Yo? ¿Sí? Ok. Un segundito. ¿Ya está listo para traducir?
Sí. ¿Sí? Bueno, en primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por invitarnos a recuperar el conocimiento que se ha hecho en los países del sur como México. Gracias. Y bueno, a mí me gustaría comentar que, bueno, yo he estado particularmente interesada también en este tema de intentar reflexionar sobre las relaciones de género desde los países del sur, y lo que me he encontrado es que pues una enorme dificultad a veces por separar el norte del sur, porque bueno, encuentro por ejemplo que muchos pensadores se han formado en países del norte, por un lado, y por otro también una gran riqueza de pensadores que, aunque desarrollan su trabajo de investigación en países del norte como en Estados Unidos, bueno, son de origen mexicano, en este caso, por ejemplo, pues ha habido todo un pensamiento chicano acerca de las relaciones de género, muy importante. De hecho, aquí tuvimos una sesión la semana pasada justamente sobre feminismo chicano. Entonces, pues un poco es reflexionar sobre esto, preguntarle cómo lidiar con esta dificultad que existe hoy en día en pensar que el sur, en dónde está el sur, ¿no? Sí, con todo el tema de la migración, el sur muchas veces está en el mismo norte, ¿no? Ese sería mi comentario. Gracias.
Gracias. ¿Alguien más?
¿Alguien más? Yo siempre, pero no sé. Van a pensarlo, no sé si hay alguien en redes. Mientras se inspiran, ¿no? Yo también tengo cosas que decir, pero prefiero que pregunten. A lo mejor, no sé, preguntarle más a profundidad sobre gente que mencionó y que puede llegar a ser interesante para ustedes, dónde conseguir eso, cómo estar en contacto con ese tipo de pensamiento, no sé, ¿no? Como ese tipo de cosas que alguna gente yo la conocía y a otra gente no conocía la que estaba mencionando, pero parece súper interesante, ¿no?
Yo tengo una pregunta. Mencionó en algún momento que la colonización afectó también a los colonizadores. Me gustaría pedirle si puede abundar un poquito a qué se refiere. Digo, puedo imaginar, pero me gustaría escucharlo de usted. Y también mencionó sobre que las personas que investigan o incluso en general cualquier profesionista que se pueda llamar internacional tiene bases del norte, incluso si es del sur o si está estudiando el sur, se prepara en el norte y necesita tener conexiones fuertes allá, etcétera. Pero ¿hay alternativa a esto? En algún momento más adelante mencionó algo así como que no hay mucha, pero me gustaría pedirle si puede decir qué se puede hacer, si nos interesa el decolonialismo, pero para no irnos al norte a estudiar cómo liberar al sur de la mente, bueno, algo como eso. ¿Qué alternativas hay? Gracias.
¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Sí, la primera yo.
Bueno, hola, buenas noches. No sé exactamente cómo se llama, buenos días o buenas tardes. Yo tengo algo que a mí me parece fascinante, que desde hace mucho tiempo me he preguntado, es cómo estudiar o cómo hacer un análisis de género en el Medio Oriente. Es algo que todavía me sigue llamando mucho la atención. En lo particular, sobre su presentación, quisiera que pudiera profundizar, explicarnos mucho más acerca de esta teórica, no recuerdo, lo escribí aquí, pero no lo tengo muy bien. Ajá, sí, la que utiliza la metodología islámica para el análisis de género. Si pudiera ahondar un poco en esta cuestión de la metodología islámica de análisis de género, me parece realmente fascinante. Quisiera saber un poco más sobre en qué consiste. Otra cosa que a mí me parecería fascinante estudiarlo, alguna vez me lo planteé en mi cabeza, y esto hace que haga como un poco más difícil la cuestión de la investigación, porque muchas veces el investigador ve el problema, digamos, prácticamente a veces lo tiene que inventar, ¿no? Por decirlo de alguna forma. Entonces, yo me he preguntado sobre la disidencia sexual en países del Medio Oriente, y me da la impresión de que al preguntármelo es prácticamente inventarlo, ¿no? Voy a explicar un poco en qué sentido. No estoy segura de cómo se podría hacer, cómo se podría levantar una voz, digamos, con el reconocimiento de una sexualidad diferente en un país, o bueno, los países del Medio Oriente, donde pues las mujeres tienen una muy poca introducción o representación hacia lo público, ¿no? Entonces, a mí en lo particular me causa este choque por la cuestión de si existe o no un planteamiento de esa naturaleza, o también cómo podríamos hablar de algo así, sí, considerando que muchas de estas categorías vienen específicamente de académicas o de reflexiones y de investigaciones que son del norte, ¿no? Entonces, un poco, yo creo que se puede hacer un trabajo en conjunto, ¿no? Eso sería lo ideal. Un poco, es interesante que ahora el norte lea al sur, ¿no? Y lo malo es que el sur como que no deja de tener esa autoridad o esa como jerarquía, ¿no? En la que el norte parece más oficial que el resto. Pero de alguna forma, cómo analizar estos fenómenos y un poco tratando de conjugar estas categorías que vienen del norte, pero a partir, digamos, de una innovación o de esta epistemología del sur. No sé si haya quedado ahí algo.
Creo que eso es suficiente ahí, ¿no? Y ya si lo pensamos más, ya tengo una, pero después, para ver si nos da tiempo que nos contesten.
Is it okay? Can you answer these first questions, please? Fabián, necesitamos quitar el... Oh, Professor, can you unmute your microphone, please? Gracias. Yes, that's right.
Okay, I've unmuted.
Thank you very much. Do you want to answer these first questions?
Well, I'd love to, but I'm sorry, my Spanish is not good enough to follow them.
Don't worry, we have the translator.
Pero entendió las preguntas.
Oh,
were the questions, did you hear the transmission in English or only in Spanish?
Only in Spanish.
okay.
Oh dear me, something failed there.
Okay, we can repeat that.
We can repeat the questions in English.
Can we summarize them?
Excuse me?
¿Se pueden resumir esas preguntas?
Yes,
Porque ya pasó tiempo.
of course.
Ok, bueno, primero, gracias. Sí, okay.
No, if you can repeat
Thank
them in
you.
English.
¿En English?
No.
En Spanish, or
En español, ¿no?
en español.
Él escucha.
Excuse me, Professor, do you listen to the translator?
I can hear the translation now.
Okay, very good.
Ok.
Thank you.
Bueno, en primer lugar, dije que muchas gracias por invitarnos a pues hacer este reconocimiento del conocimiento que se hace en los países del sur como México. Y también quería compartir una inquietud que a mí me ha surgido en este interés por pensar las relaciones de género desde esta posición de países del sur. Y es que me parece muy difícil separar el norte del sur, me parece que es difícil hoy en día ubicarlos en un punto geográfico, porque de pronto encontramos grandes pensadores latinoamericanos o de otros países del sur que se han formado en países del norte y bueno, que tienen esta influencia, ¿no?, a pesar de desarrollar su trabajo en estas latitudes. O, como yo les decía, pensadores que pues han migrado a estos países y que han desarrollado teorías muy potentes. Y justamente recordaba yo sobre los feminismos chicanos, que aquí mismo lo revisamos la semana pasada. Entonces, mi pregunta era un poco cómo lidiar con esto, si cada vez es tan difícil ubicar dónde está el norte y dónde el sur.
Bien, yo pregunto, mencionó sobre los colonizadores. Ellos son influenciados al momento de colonizar, ellos lo fueron, lo son. Si pudiera hablar un poquito más sobre esto, de qué manera son ellos impactados. Y hablo también sobre académicos, académicas que se preparan en el norte, aún si quieren estudiar el sur. Y me gustaría preguntarle si hay alternativa. En algún momento mencionó como que no hay mucha, pero no sé qué más se pueda decir al respecto. Gracias.
Yep. And there was a fourth question.
Excuse me?
Había una cuarta pregunta.
Yes.
La maestra Connell dice.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, there was.
Bueno, primero, digamos, es como algo que me gustaría que pudiera profundizar. El asunto cuando nos mencionó a Mernissi, ¿me dijeron? Mernissi, esta teórica que trabaja con la metodología islámica de análisis de género. Me gustaría que pudiera profundizar un poco más en cómo sucede, cómo se realiza esta metodología, que me parece fascinante. Por este mismo asunto, ¿no? Me gustaría, no sé exactamente cómo plantear esto. A mí desde hace mucho tiempo me había planteado en mi mente la cuestión de un problema, o digamos como la posibilidad de un problema, de la existencia de un problema sobre la disidencia sexual en países de Medio Oriente. Ahora, me resulta difícil pensar, ¿no? Cómo podría ser algo así en lugares donde las mujeres no tienen acceso a un espacio público, una voz en un espacio público, una representación, digamos, en espacios compartidos. Y digamos, de alguna forma, el investigador a veces tiene que, a veces como, yo decía, como inventa un problema, ¿no? En el sentido de que le da un nombre, ¿sí? Y cómo hacer, digamos, esto cuando, digamos, las categorías con las que normalmente trabaja el investigador suelen venir del norte, ¿no? Ahora, la idea es precisamente que esas categorías puedan ser deconstruidas, ¿no? Digamos, como utilizadas a un espacio en el sur, o como para hacer categorías propias del sur. Y yo quisiera saber si existe algún autor, alguna corriente que trate sobre esto, si la hay o si no la hay, y cómo se podría ser una posibilidad para hablar de eso, ¿no? Porque me imagino que si un problema es que la mujer o las mujeres tengan el acceso a esos espacios para hablar, digamos como una cuestión de comunidad feminista, ¿no? ¿Cómo hacerlo ahora para hablar sobre disidencia sexual, ¿no? Hablar como feminismos y aparte como lesbianismos, ¿no? O no sé, diferencias, ¿no? O disidencias sexuales. Muchas gracias.
¿Quieren aprovechar este bloque?
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Now, am I coming through? Can you hear me?
¿Me pueden escuchar?
Sí.
Good.
Bien.
On the first
La
question,
primera pregunta,
the expatriate,
los expatriados,
expatriate intellectuals
los
are
intelectuales
very interesting
expatriados
group.
son un grupo
in
muy
gender
disparejo
studies.
en cuestiones de género.
They have had a very significant impact
Tenido un impacto muy significativo
in the global north.
en el norte global,
People like Chandra Topade Mohanty,
como Chandra Mohanty,
Gayatri Spivak,
Gayatri Spivak,
both with a background in India,
Ambos
and
con
of
fondo en
course
India
the Chicana feminists,
y con las
uh,
feministas chicanas,
whose
por otro lado,
situation
la
is
situación
somewhat different from that of
que
migrants,
también tienen otra mentalidad como migrantes,
and also the
también
black feminists in the United
las
States
feministas negras en Estados Unidos
with their Afro-American heritage
con sus
are in a
herederos
different position.
norteamericanos también tienen otras posturas.
Now, this group has opened up.
Este grupo se ha ampliado.
The issue of post-colonial consciousness
De
in the
conciencia
global north
posterior en el norte mundial.
I think someone like Mohanty
Que
has been very important,
ha sido muy importante
impacting the
en
consciousness and the curricula of
la
gender
conciencia
studies.
y la currícula de estudios de género
In the English-speaking world.
en el mundo angloparlante.
So it is now usual for a gender studies program
Los programas de estudio de género
in the United States or in Western Europe
y en Europa Oriental
to have a component
que hay
of
un grupo
post-colonial feminism,
de feministas postcoloniales,
but the people that they quote
gente
in
que citan
that part of the curriculum will be
su currículo se
Mohanty, Spivak, and Zaldua, the people of that sort.
gente de esa clase o de ese género.
And
Y
it seems to me that has shifted the ground a little,
movido un poquito el terreno,
but has not actually made very much difference to the situation of the
generado un cambio
much larger
situación
group of researchers,
más
theorists,
amplio de
activists
investigadores y activistas
who stay in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, the Arab world, East Asia, Southeast Asia.
África, el sudeste de Asia y demás lugares.
So and that's the main focus of my argument, I
El
guess.
enfoque principal, creo yo, de mi argumento.
Coming to the second question, how the colonizers were
Y en
impacted.
cuanto a la segunda pregunta, ¿cómo fueron impactados los colonizadores?
One important issue was raised by Ashish Nandi,
Un tema muy importante fue sugerido por Ashish Nandi,
and that was the, if you like, the narrowing of patterns of masculinity
quisieran pensarlo, fue el estrechamiento de los patrones de masculinidad
around issues of violence and domination.
en torno a
So the militarization of masculinity
por la militarización de la masculinidad que había.
is an important aspect of
Un aspecto muy
imperial
importante de los
gender
imperialistas en el mundo.
The best single piece of research about this that I know comes from South Africa.
La mejor pieza sencilla de este tipo de investigación viene de África del Sur.
It's by Robert Morell, the historian I mentioned,
El historiador,
and it's a book called From Boys to Gentlemen.
y es un libro llamado De chiquillos a caballeros.
It's a history of the making of masculinity in colonial South Africa.
Y es una historia de cómo se construye la masculinidad en Sudáfrica colonial.
And the book will be hard to find, but some of the work is online as journal articles.
Y aunque el libro va a ser difícil de conseguir, pero está en línea como artículos de investigación.
For the third question, about what the issue of what alternatives are there to going to the global north to get training and recognition.
En cuanto a ir hacia el norte global para obtener el entrenamiento y el reconocimiento.
And here I have to say that I got my PhD in Australia.
Y aquí yo tengo que decir que obtuve mi doctorado en Australia.
And I was the first person in my department to get a PhD.
Y yo fui la primera persona en mi departamento de obtener el doctorado.
Because in the 1960s, Australian universities were just beginning to develop a research capacity.
Porque en los 1960 las universidades de Australia apenas iniciaban el desarrollo de una capacidad para investigación.
Before that, any Australian intellectual who wanted a higher degree, a research degree, had to go to London or, Boston or Chicago.
Porque antes de eso, cualquier australiano que deseara obtener mayor desarrollo como investigador, pues tendría que ir a Londres o a Boston o a Chicago.
So since then, Australian universities have been building up a research capacity, a capability to produce doctoral training.
Así de que desde entonces las universidades australianas han estado acrecentando su capacidad de desarrollar investigadores y tener sus propios programas para ampliarse.
So we now have the capacity, just as Mexican universities have the capacity, to produce a research workforce.
Así es de que nosotros ya ya tenemos la capacidad para desarrollar una fuerza de investigadores, así como se está haciendo en México.
The trouble is that our degrees are less prestigious than degrees from Columbia or Harvard or Oxford or Berlin or Paris.
Claro es de que nuestros títulos, nuestros grados, pues tienen menos prestigio que los de Harvard o Londres o Berlín o París.
So there is now a kind of global hierarchy of PhDs which still has the effect of producing intellectual dominance by the global north.
Así que aún sigue habiendo una jerarquía mundial de los grados o los doctorados que sigue dejando pues esa dominancia por el norte mundial, por el norte global.
So to me, part of the problem now is to build up our confidence in the institutions that exist in the global periphery and interrupt the deference towards the theorists and thinkers of the North.
Así que para mí ahorita ya la cuestión es que empezar a crear un nivel de prestigio y aceptación que los sureños puedan interrumpir o al menos interceptar con los del norte para que ya no sigan formando una periferia.
So this is one reason why I run around the world talking about Amina Mama, Hele Sapioti, Vina Agarwal, Ashish Nandi, Fatima Mernissi, and so forth, saying, look here, look there, look over here. All of these interesting, important thinkers which have been produced and are tremendous resources to build on.
Y por eso es por lo que yo me lo paso dando vueltas por todo el mundo hablando acerca de la investigadora de Argentina o de Colombia, de Marruecos o demás, para que se diga, mira, todos estos recursos que hay aquí, vean todo lo que se está produciendo en estas otras regiones.
But I don't think this can happen only in the academic world. It also involves creating new connections or reviving connections between academic institutions, social movements, knowledge projects in popular communities, popular classes.
Pero yo no creo, por lo tanto, que esto solamente se deba o se puede estar dando en los grupos académicos, sino que también debe de aterrizarse en las comunidades, en los grupos locales, en los activistas, en los niveles más modestos, para que realmente se puedan entretejer más relaciones.
And this, of course, is contradictory to the neoliberal agenda for universities now, which attempt to tie universities into a global hierarchy centered on the norm.
Y esto, claro, va en contra de la agenda neoliberalista de las universidades que tratan de generar una jerarquía donde siga predominando el norte mundial, el norte global.
About the fourth question, the theoretician I mentioned was Fatima Mernissi.
Y esta la pregunta, la teórica que mencioné es Fatima Mernissi,
who did a study of gender relations in Morocco in the early 1970s.
que hizo un estudio una investigación de géneros en Marruecos a principios de los 70s.
And unusually for that time, made it not just a study of women's situation, but a study of men's situation too, and the dilemmas of masculinity in a post-colonial society.
Y que poco común para esa época. No nada más fue un estudio de las cuestiones de las mujeres, sino también fue un estudio de la masculinidad, lo cual fue muy interesante para una zona postcolonial.
Now, Fatima is not the only scholar in the Arab world who has been doing this. There is now, in English, a literature about masculinities in the Arab world.
Ahora, Fátima no es la única académica que ha hecho trabajos de esta naturaleza acerca de masculinidad. Ya también hay obras acerca de esto en el idioma inglés.
One of the authors to look for is Mai Gussoub, Ghoussoub.
Y uno de los autores para buscar esto es Mai Gussoub.
And I can give one or two other references if you like to email me.
Referencias adicionales, si me gustan enviar un correo electrónico.
The point that you made about the difficulty of developing ideas and knowledge where there is heavy social constraint on women's public presence is true.
Y el punto que hicieron acerca de las restricciones que hay de la presencia pública en ciertas regiones del mundo también es cierto.
There is very interesting situation that has developed in the world's biggest Islamic country, which is Indonesia.
Que hay una situación que ha surgido, que se ha hecho muy interesante en el país islámico más grande del mundo, que es Indonesia.
Which is a very culturally plural, country.
Es un país culturalmente sumamente pluralista, muy variado.
With different versions of Islam
Con diferentes
within
versiones del Islam dentro de un mismo proyecto social.
and therefore different levels of repression of women.
Y por lo tanto con diferentes niveles de represión contra las mujeres.
And a lively women's movement which has developed since the end of the dictatorship there.
Y movimientos activistas de mujeres muy activos que se han desarrollado después del fin de la dictadura allá.
And again, I'd be very happy to, if people are interested in learning about that, I'd be very happy to give a reference or two.
Y de nuevo, si les interesa a las personas saber acerca de esto, me daría mucho gusto para quienes les interese enviarles referencias acerca de esto.
So,
First of all, thank you so very much, Dr. Connell.
okay.
There is a... Hi? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. There is another question. I think it's the last one, but it's really important. I will read it in Spanish and the translator will translate it for you. Okay? ¿Cómo abordar contextos periféricos dentro de nuestro mismo país, México? Por ejemplo, ¿cómo abordar las relaciones de género que se dan en comunidades indígenas con base en epistemologías otras o desde sus propias cosmovisiones de género? Y que no se impongan hegemónicamente la perspectiva del liberalismo occidental,
and not to impose the hegemony of Western liberalism,
que a fin de cuentas es el marco teórico en el cual se guían los estudios de género en México.
which in the end is obviously the theoretical framework that guides gender studies in Mexico.
Y otra pregunta también de la misma persona que dice, ¿es posible conciliar la perspectiva occidental con las epistemologías del sur?
And is it possible to reconcile the Western line of the Western school of thought with the epistemologies of the South?
Y esta es una pregunta que nos llegó desde Facebook de una persona que se llama Compa Nicte Espadas.
This is a question that arrived through Facebook.
Okay, the issue that you raised for Mexico is also an issue that exists in Australia, which is a settler colonial country with a majority settler population and a minority indigenous population. So I quoted two indigenous sources of ideas.
Les diré acerca de las ideas sobre los aspectos indigenistas que hemos visto en Australia.
Marcia Langton and the three women who painted the picture. And I have thought it's my job as an intellectual of the settler population to learn from Aboriginal thought not trying to override it or to impose a framework on it, but so far as I can to engage with Aboriginal thought and, among other things, for what it might tell me about my own culture. I think, those relationships exist in different key configurations right across the post-colonial world.
A través de todo el mundo postcolonial.
So it's actually a very important issue
Es un aspecto
for
muy
thinking
importante.
about knowledge democracy on a world scale.
La democracia del conocimiento en escala mundial.
So, for instance, it's not just about saying, oh, there's a Chinese view and a Western view.
Del punto de vista de los chinos o de los occidentales.
China is, you know, a plural society, a plural culture too, with internal colonialism.
También China es una sociedad pluralista y con colonialismo interno y con puntos de vista muy variados en regiones también que son muy culturalmente diferentes.
What is now the center of the West, i.e. the United States, is the product of a settler colonial society. It still has an indigenous population, has migrant populations. All of this complexity exists.
Y por ejemplo, los Estados Unidos aún es una sociedad centrada en el occidente, sin embargo tiene poblaciones nativas, pero también está teniendo poblaciones de migrantes, aunque su origen fue de colonizaje.
In a context of massive differences of wealth and institutional power.
En un contexto de diferencias masivas culturales y de tremendo poder.
So I see the problems as how to combine learning processes where we benefit from the diversity of knowledges.
Así de que ver esto desde un punto de vista de diversos procesos y aprendizaje común diverso tiene mucho en lo que se puede conjugar.
Combine that with a politics of solidarity that acknowledges the, you know, different levels of exploitation, disruption and poverty that go together with knowledge plurality. So I don't think we can separate the epistemological issues from the political issues of global inequality, or at least we need to think them together as much as possible.
Hay que conjuntarlas lo más posible.
¿Alguien más?
Anyone else?
Sí, no. Tal vez. Well, ¿alguien más, no? I had a question, but I don't know if it's. I have to make it in Spanish, pero creo que es un poco complicado pensar. A ver. Mi pregunta o mi reflexión o mi invitación es a invitarte a pensar cómo, o que nos ilumines con una reflexión sobre cómo pensamos la idea de la hegemonía también cuando, a ver, es que tengo que organizar mi cabeza, pero es... La blanquitud es una característica que se ha utilizado como para dominar, porque los imperios han sido regularmente, los que conocemos en Occidente han sido imperios blancos. Sin embargo, es importante, como tú estás mencionando, que ciertas poblaciones, a pesar de que tengan un fenotipo blanco, no son consideradas como blancas. En el caso de Australia, en el caso de los países de Europa del Este, que son menos legítimos, aunque la blanquitud sea una característica que se cumple. Entonces, a mí me parece importante pensar en cómo este devenir sur, aunque tengas un fenotipo blanco, es importante también ponerlo en el mapa de la percepción de no solo por ser blanco eres colonialista y no solo por ser oscuro tienes un antiprivilegio. Hay gente que sí, que obviamente el racismo existe, pero cómo pensar esta complejidad en los sures, cómo considerar la blanquitud como una posibilidad de sur también. Esa sería como la pregunta, cómo el fenotipo blanco también a veces participa de cierto sur y que eso no está como muy visibilizado. Entonces me gustaría, no sé si tienes alguna idea sobre esto, es algo que me estoy preguntando ahora también, y cómo a lo mejor el devenir mujer, en el sentido de la mujer como una categoría política e histórica que supone menos privilegios que la masculinidad, que les está atravesando a muchos varones y a muchas mujeres también, y a muchas mujeres trans. ¿Cómo se piensa esta articulación entre el género y la disidencia sexual a partir de tu reflexión sobre la teoría del sur? Esa sería más bien la pregunta. Gracias.
Yeah, that's an incredibly complex issue, of course. Whiteness, from my understanding, is essentially a product of European imperialism and the construction of colonial society, a hierarchy in colonial societies, which was a gradual process in imperialism. The insistence on whiteness as a marker that is racial thinking was something that emerged gradually in imperial history. It took a particularly toxic shape in Australia, where the English settled population established a kind of racial hierarchy over the Irish settled population, but combined with the Irish settlers to define their superiority over the indigenous population. And then later in the 19th century, built exclusion laws against Chinese immigration. And that created a political configuration called White Australia, which was a racist immigration policy that operated until the 1960s and has re-emerged in a covert way in right-wing mobilization against refugees and migrants from which is a very distressing feature of Australian politics. So that's just one example of the histories of the creation of hierarchy, social hierarchy, in colonial and post-colonial situations. And we could trace such histories with different details in much of the colonized world. And analogous processes, for instance, in marginalization of Eastern Europe, which I think is a case you were right to mention, because there is just now emerging a kind of post-colonial thought in Eastern Europe, which involves the critique of the dependence and marginality of the post-communist societies of Eastern Europe. When we speak of global north and global south.
Cuando se habla del norte y sur global,
It is important
es importante
to think of this as
pensar en esto como
a relationship, not a pair of watertight categories.
no un par de categorías definidas.
It's sort of naming the relationship of power, authority, wealth and difference between north and south is just the start of analysis, not the end of it.
Así es de que darle nombres o categorizaciones de poder, riqueza, autoridad, solamente es el inicio del análisis, no el fin.
And we need to, as soon as we start doing concrete analysis, we need to weave in those complexities of internal colonialism, impacts of migration, patterns of investment.
Tenemos que ver lo que es el colonialismo interno y los patrones de migración para poderlo ver más completamente.
And the history of disruption and remaking of social orders in colonialism and in post-colonial world economy seems to me to require a different understanding of hegemony. So the concept of hegemony, including the concept of hegemonic masculinity, were developed in relation to a relatively stable social order. If you like, an integrated class structure and an integrated gender structure.
Si quieren como una clase integrada o una estructura de género integrada.
But in colonization, you have societies being torn apart, and in many post-colonial development situations, you have massive social disruption and rebuilding of social relations. And in those kinds of circumstances, we can't presume hegemony. So I'm increasingly thinking that we need to understand hegemony, not in terms of established patterns of authority, but in terms of hegemonic projects.
Tenemos que pensar en términos de objetos de hegemonía, además de los patrones de desenvolvimiento o de destrucción.
That is, social attempts to create a pattern of authority, centrality, and established power.
Sí, y también de los patrones de intentos de desarrollar autoridad, centralización y centros de poder.
So I think of neoliberalism itself as a kind of grand hegemonic project trying to establish the centrality and authority of a market-based understanding of society.
Puede pensar en el programa neoliberalista como un programa inmenso tratando de establecer patrones de autoridad.
And we see various hegemonic projects in gender relations too, with attempts by different groups of men to establish their authority in a relatively fluid situation.
Y también vemos varios proyectos de hegemonía, de masculinidad, para establecer sus formas de autoridad y dominio de género.
That's how I now understand transnational business masculinity as an attempt to impose gender order on the world.
Así es como podemos entender las figuras de autoridad masculinas en negocios transnacionales para establecer su forma de control.
And I would see fundamentalist movements in the Islamic world and in the Christian world, like the evangelical movements as attempts to establish a new hegemony of a certain gender order.
Yo también vería movimientos de fundamentalismo religioso como los musulmanes o los evangélicos cristianos, para también establecer algunos patrones de hegemonía de género.
That's the line of thought that I'm pursuing anyway.
Al menos es una forma de pensamiento que yo estoy persiguiendo.
Thank you very much, Raewyn. Do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear.
Thank you very much, and I hope that you are not too tired, because we just take a lot of time from you, but we are really glad to hear you, and we are really grateful about it, about your share your experience and your thought with us. And also I want to personally I want to say thanks, or thank you, because you really are a really friendly thinker. So the friendship concept that you said before, it's really in the practice you make practice with that, and it's really important in my case, for me, and I feel really good, because in academics it's not that usual, that gesture, or that kind of that attitude. So thank you very much, Raewyn, and maybe someone here want to have your email. I will pass it if you
please do.
Yeah.
Yes.
And thank you, big hug, and everybody here is saying just bye.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see it.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. It's been very interesting for me too.
Thank you.
So bye then.
Bye. Good afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Thank you.
Hoy, pues tenemos un pequeño ambigú, si gustan acompañarnos, un vinito y hay algunas cosas que comer. Hay muchas cosas en el tintero. Si están interesados en tener el correo de Raewyn Connell, que supongo que sí, ya vieron que es muy interesante el trabajo que hace, y también muy justo con otros pensadores y otras pensadoras. Tenemos el correo, escríbanos y se los podemos pasar. ¿Ok? Entonces, bueno, gracias, damos por finalizado. Otra cosa, trataremos de dar seguimiento al seminario, que no se termine en esta ocasión, pero bueno, a lo mejor va a tener otro tipo de ordenamiento, no sé, todavía no sabemos nada, pero esperemos que se pueda dar seguimiento, no sé si cada mes, pero igual en algunas otras sesiones, y los mantendremos informados porque tenemos los correos, así que igual, si siguen interesados, pues también cualquier duda, escríbanos, y la gente que nos están mandando colaboraciones para publicar en el libro, pues manténgate también en contacto, ¿no? Sati, ¿quieres decir algo?
Sí, bueno, ya nos estamos despidiendo, y también dar muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Bueno, creo que son el grupo que se mantuvo más presente, ¿verdad? Y también a quienes nos acompañen por internet. Fue una experiencia muy bonita para nosotras, fue mucho trabajo, esperamos que haya sido de provecho tanto para ustedes como para ustedes, y les enriquezca de alguna manera. Yo me imagino que sí va a ser así. Y también quiero agradecer muchísimo al equipo de COLEF, porque lo estuvimos trabajando a la par que nosotros. En especial está Fabián, que está aquí en la cabina y nos asistió casi en todas las sesiones. Quiero agradecer al Departamento de Comunicación, Gina, Diana, Eduardo, nuestro diseñador estrella. Si a ustedes les gustaron los carteles, bueno.
Fue Eduardo aquí, Eduardo Lozano, aquí en la esquina.
Sí, muchísimas
Lo
gracias.
teníamos cada mes trabajando y todavía lo tenemos ahí, pobrecito, mucha paciencia.
Claro, Mónica
De servicios
de
generales.
transporte,
Ujú.
los choferes, no tengo aquí todos sus nombres, pero a varios, o si no es que a todos les tocó hacer estos recorridos, a Juanito que nos apoya aquí con el servicio de cafetería siempre, al equipo de UABC, cuando estuvimos en las sesiones allá, Andrea, que está aquí presente, que es parte del equipo, Alberto Paz.
Que no vino el día de hoy, pero que también es parte.
Así es, hay personas que han venido desde Mexicali, aquí tenemos 2 de ellas, muchas gracias por hacer el viaje
gracias.
cada sesión.
Sí.
Y pues bueno,
Sí, bueno, al señor José Luis, el intérprete, que nos hizo el
claro,
favor también
por supuesto.
de traducir a la sesión pasada a Cherry y esta sesión a Raewyn. Y bueno, también a Alfonso Caravero, que toma las fotos, a Katia Sepúlveda, que está aquí filmando, y bueno, a todos y todas ustedes por asistir, que sin ustedes pues tampoco tendría mucho sentido el seminario. Seguramente se nos está quedando alguien en el tintero. A mí me gustaría también agradecer especialmente a Sati, que ha hecho mucho trabajo, que ha tenido el entusiasmo de seguir y seguir sin ningún tipo de remuneración, porque no estamos cobrando por esto, estamos haciéndolo por el gusto de hacerlo, por el feminismo y por el debate, pero sí ha hecho mucho trabajo de manera muy eficiente. Entonces, pues muchas gracias a todas y a todos, esperemos darle seguimiento.